This is Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball discussion, hosted by Inside the Hall founder and editor, Alex Bozich. Since 2007, Inside the Hall has been trusted by IU fans across the globe to be the one-stop shop for IU basketball news, commentary, and analysis. Join us over at InsideTheHall.com. That's InsideTheHall.com.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. Pleased to be joined for the second time, I think, in a month. We had him on, I think, a couple weeks before the regular season started. He's a good friend. Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star. Welcome back to the show, Zach.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be back. Always good to be back.
So the last time we talked, I looked, it was, I think, November. Obviously, we talk every day, but I'm talking for this podcast. We talked on November 12th. At that point, Indiana didn't have a Big Ten schedule for basketball. We didn't really know where things were headed for the season. And since then, a lot has happened. Indiana opened the season at home against Tennessee Tech, won the game pretty easily, went to Asheville, played in the Maui event in Asheville. I'm sure they would have liked to have gone to Maui, but obviously that didn't happen. 2-1 there. And then last night, as we record this on Thursday afternoon, Indiana goes to Florida State and loses by 2 in overtime, in which was a pretty good effort, I thought, from Indiana. Zach, just from an overall kind of high level perspective, what have been your impressions of Indiana through 5 games, Indiana basketball? What have maybe you learned so far about this team, and what do you still feel like we're going to figure out here as Big Ten play begins in less than 2 weeks?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think, first of all, it really just can't be understated that Indiana's playing games. I mean, and that sounds so simple, but like Butler's not playing right now, and they don't really know when they're going to start playing again, at least not in a firm way. There's other programs around the country that are in similar positions. I think I saw just today that possibly South Carolina had to pause. And that may come to Indiana at some point. Obviously, it's nobody's immune to this. We're talking about the virus, but at the moment, Indiana's playing games, which means Indiana's putting quality wins down on paper. It's getting a chance to study meaningful film. I was sorting through my first stock watch kind of feature of the season, and it struck me the numbers Trace Jackson Davis is putting up when 4 of his 5 opponents are high major opponents. And so you're also getting better, and you're learning more about yourself in a really short space of time, games-wise, which is, I think, going to be very, very important for Indiana as they approach the Big Ten season. I think there's a lot of good. Indiana's defending obviously very, very well, despite maybe being a bit of a sort of, average rebounding team. I think rebounding has been a really big part of this team's defensive profile the last couple of years, and it's not right now. I don't know if it's necessarily quite as bad as Archie Miller feels like it is, although, of course, he's the coach, so really what I think doesn't matter that much with regard to Indiana's rebounding performance, but it certainly is not sort of this lockdown strength that it has been the last couple of years. And yet Indiana is still defending very well. And again, against high major competition pretty consistently. Trace Jackson Davis, of course, looks very good. I think Armand Franklin looks greatly improved from a season ago. I think this is a team that maybe is going to be more capable of defending its way through its cold stretches most nights. Last season we would see Indiana maybe, the offense would go cold. The defense would stick around for 3 or 4 minutes, but eventually guys would just sort of lose faith, and you could see it. And it wasn't like they were giving up. It was just something maybe a little bit more inherent or a little bit more sort of fundamental, and games would get away from them. Now that did kind of happen in the Texas game, but the response both in the Stanford game and then certainly I think the response to a similar start as Texas last night against Florida State suggests that this team is maybe more capable of that this season. And is perhaps ready to be something resembling, sort of a borderline elite defensive team. The offensive issues remain a concern. And, for me, it's not even just, I was running some numbers today. It's not even just the 3-point shooting, 28.8%. I think that number will come up some this season, though I don't know how much. But right now, Indiana players, not counting Trace Jackson Davis or Race Thompson, are only shooting 44.7% on twos. And that number is way too low, especially if given the fact that if you're watching these games back, the offense is working. It's getting driving lanes. It's getting penetration. Indiana's done a great job of getting the baseline pretty consistently so far this season. It's getting the ball to the rim, and you don't have to be finishing 75% of your twos. And yes, it's also worth saying those numbers are a little bit skewed by Indiana having played already two of the longest and most athletic teams they'll probably face all season. But you got to be better than that. And you got to be better than that on twos, because you can't count on the 3-point line to just make up for the difference. And if they can be a little bit better, and we're not talking, a lot better. I mean, if they make literally 3 or 4 more shots last night, then they're 4-1, and they're only the 4th team in the last 70 games to beat Florida State in the Tucker Center. So they're not far, but this is the advantage of playing these hard games early, at least in my mind, is you get a very sort of raw and honest view of what's good and what needs fixing quickly.
Yeah, I feel overall, even though they've lost 2 games, I think you have to look at what they've been able to do so far as a positive. There's a lot of teams that haven't played this ambitious of a schedule. There's, you just look at another Big Ten team. Michigan's 5-0, but they haven't played a high major team yet. I think Indiana going through this schedule should help them when they get to Big Ten play, be prepared for what's ahead. And we know it's going to be difficult just based on the sheer number of elite teams and the balance kind of after you get past that top group of teams. There's a lot of really good teams in the middle, and there's teams at the bottom of the pack. You look at what Penn State did the other night, going to Virginia Tech and winning by 20. There's not any games that you look at and say, we're going to win that game for sure. So, but the one thing I feel like I keep coming back to every game, I feel like I'm writing the same thing, and you may feel the same way, but the shooting from the perimeter, do you think we're overstating the importance of that being absent still, or do you think that remains a thing that is limiting this team's ceiling as a group? Because it just seems like ever since Archie Miller's gotten here, 3-point shooting has been a deficiency. I know it's not a huge emphasis in terms of what they try to do offensively, but I look back at that game last night against Florida State, and they got the lead by 2 points many times. I think there was one instance where they had it at 3 in overtime. That was the biggest lead they had, and it feels like if they had somebody that could knock down a couple of perimeter shots, they could get a little bit more separation, and it just doesn't feel like that they've made much progress in that regard. Do you think that this is being overstated as an issue, or do you think it's something that we're going to continue to talk about and harp on until there's some type of improvement shown?
I think there's kind of layers to this now, more so than the last couple seasons. I think first of all, it's you have to acknowledge that the shooting's just, it hasn't been kind of at a high enough standard. If you look at Indiana's best 3-point percentage under Archie Miller as a team still only finished 204th nationally. And that was last season, 32.6% as a team. You're right. They don't overemphasize it. And I sort of suspect, and this is a belief I've held for a while, and I've probably peppered you with this conspiracy theory or whatever you want to say. I think we've kind of we've passed critical mass on shooting in college basketball, like in the way that West Coast offenses did in the early 2000s in college. It's such the done thing. It's the modern way forward offensively in the game. And in the NBA, that's not a problem because the NBA has its, can handpick from all the best players in the world. But as that starts to filter down to college, it'll work for some people, but then you'll get diminishing returns as more and more people think this is how I have to win. The stat I cite a lot is that I think it was 5 years ago, there were either 11 or 12 teams in the Big Ten that shot at least 33% from behind the arc in Big Ten play. Last year it was 5. And the year before that, I think it was 6 or 7. So the point is, I think 3-point shooting in general, and some of that's obviously also moving the line back, but 3-point shooting in general has been in a bit of a statistical decline the last couple seasons. I think there's a couple things I will say. First of all, yes, that number needs to come up. Second of all, part of the reason I bring up Indiana's 2-point percentage, and again, it's, right now Indiana is finishing 49.5% of its twos, which is too low of a number, and kind of as a reference point, that is exactly where Indiana finished last season as well. So if you're looking for, in 2 years ago, they were finishing more than 53% of their twos. So if you're kind of looking for, again, sort of reference points on where Indiana can improve, that's a big one. I share a theory with our good friend Dustin DePirac, which is that if Indiana is going to play these smaller lineups, it may not always be about making the threes as much as being willing to take some of them. Because if you're going to play 3 guards and Jerome Hunter, for example, then even if your team 3-point shooting profile is not particularly impressive overall, an opponent is going to look out on the floor and say that 3 or maybe even 4 players on the floor at that time could hit 4 threes in a game conceivably. And so they're naturally going to have to space out a little bit more than, for example, when Indiana was running its ultra big lineups last year with Justin Smith at the 3, Trace Jackson Davis at the 4, Joey Brunk at the 5. But, and I think that's true, and I think broadly speaking, we have seen some of that. Indiana's in the 4 high major games they've played, the most threes they've taken is 15. But I think that number could stand to come up by 2 or 3. But I bring up the 2-point percentage because I think Indiana is getting that court spacing. And as much as sometimes we talk about how is Indiana, look at all these double and triple teams that are, crashing down on Trace Jackson Davis. Well, then, I don't really know why people are so worried about the way teams are defending Trace Jackson Davis right now, because his free throw rate is 68.9%. He's drawing 8.6 fouls per 40 minutes. He's making almost 73% of his free throws. And he scored 17 points in 4 of his 5 games this season. His worst game statistically was the Providence game, which Indiana won by 21. So there's sort of this narrative of Indiana's got to hit these threes because teams are just compressing the lane on Trace Jackson Davis. Well, it's not really working. In his last 2 games, he's scored 56 points.
And they're also taking a slightly different approach in terms of how they're using him offensively with the ball screen. So they're not necessarily even putting him in situations where he can get collapsed on consistently.
But now what I would argue you actually have is his gravitational pull is part of what's creating that space for other players. And that's why 44.7% on twos from anybody that's not Trace Jackson Davis or Race Thompson just isn't enough. And, I think you can make an argument for getting Race Thompson more shots. That's not the easiest thing in the world to do when you've already got one ball dominant post player, to just go find more shots for another post player. Teams that try to do that often just wind up basically sort of trying to fit two pegs into the same hole. But, go back and watch these sets. Texas is a bit of Texas is a little bit different, but I think we may all come to find out Texas is better than we thought this season anyway. These teams Indiana's getting to the rim on these teams. Indiana's getting to the basket off the drive. It's getting into the lane. It's getting fouled. It's collapsing. Indiana's team free throw rate is, I don't think it's elite. I don't know what it is right now. But I think it's good. And Indiana is making, actually it is. It's top 30 in the country in free throws attempted versus field goals attempted. The offense is working all the way up to the point where Indiana's just not finishing around the rim. And if they do a little bit more of that, just a little bit more of that, it's early in the season, so it's small sample sizes and everything's a little bit, kind of exaggerated. But imagine what people think about this team if they make 2 more shots and win that game last night. Because then they're going to beat North Alabama on Sunday, obviously. And then they go into next week 5-1, not really knowing if they're going to play Butler. Probably at worst 5-2, more likely 6-1 or maybe 5-1, and ranked probably in the top 20 going into Big Ten play. And outside of, as impressive as Iowa and Michigan State and at times Illinois have looked, the Big Ten is suddenly looking at Indiana and saying, no, they're going to be a handful this year. So it's this is where, I mean, it's fine margins, and it's going to be fine margins in Big Ten play. It's going to be fine margins all throughout Big Ten. But to me, as much as we talk about, and I understand why people focus on the 3-point shooting because it's a long-term concern, I think the offense is working as it's built to function. But Indiana's got to finish better around the rim, and especially Indiana's guards. And I'm not calling these guys down because I think individually I see improvement in all of them this year. I think they've all individually had different times. Armand Franklin obviously has been a big sort of early season storyline. But if you're going to play guard dominant lineups, your guards can't be wasting so much at the rim. And right now they're getting there. They're just not finishing.
Hey, it's Jared, just jumping in here real quick so that we can talk about Home Field Apparel, your friends at homefieldapparel.com. You know, Christmas is coming up. You need to do your Christmas shopping, and homefieldapparel.com is definitely a stop that you need to make, both for the IU fans on your Christmas list, but also for anybody else, because it's not just IU stuff that they have right now, and they do have the best line of IU apparel, football logos, basketball logos. I mean, they have so much great stuff there for the IU fans on your list, but also they have over 90-plus schools. So, you know, Home Field Apparel's whole thing is they go and they dig into the archives of different colleges and universities, pull out these old logos and brand marks that haven't been used in a while, put them on the comfiest material, whether it's the T-shirts, the sweatshirts, whatever it is. Their material is so comfy, so nice, so high quality, and you're going to find something for everybody. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use our promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, and you will get 20% off your entire order. So the IU page for all the IU apparel, and then you can browse all the other colleges and universities, and you're sure to find something for pretty much everybody on your Christmas list. Because even if you have someone on your Christmas list that didn't go to one of the colleges or universities Home Field does, they have so many cool, unique logos, you could probably find something for that person anyway. And if nothing else, just get them a comfortable hoodie or the comfortable joggers. I mean, it's such comfortable stuff. Gets you ready for the wintertime. Go do it now. Homefieldapparel.com. Use that promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K. You will get 20% off your entire order. That's homefieldapparel.com, promo code B-R-I-N-K.
The other thing that's kind of stood out to me, maybe more so last night than other games, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, because in the off season, I hypothesized that this could be a team that, you know, could have 9 or 10, 11 guys that were contributing on a game-to-game basis. And right now, that's not the case in terms of, from a statistical standpoint, you're looking at really, last night it was 6 players carrying the load. Anthony Leal and Jordan Geronimo didn't get off the bench. Christian Lander, Trey Galloway really didn't contribute much of anything. And obviously Joey Brunk remains out, and that has kind of hampered the overall depth to an extent. But are you surprised at just kind of the overall ineffectiveness of Indiana's bench players to this point? I know they're really relying on a lot of freshmen who have not contributed or played at this level very much at all. But, you know, you look at last night and Jerome Hunter comes in and knocks in a couple of first half threes, and that was the only scoring Indiana got from the bench the entire game. Is this a situation where Indiana's going to have a much smaller rotation than we anticipated going into the season, or do you think this is something that down the road we could see some of these younger players step up and become more reliable contributors? I mean, they're going to have to play some, but right now it's just on a game-to-game basis. I don't really look at anybody that's coming off the bench and say that anything can be expected from one singular player.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different answers. Like, I think there's you know, the answer is maybe a little bit of both. Like, for example, I think Trey Galloway gets 20 minutes last night, even though there's times we're clearly struggling with the pace and the length in the game. And I suspect if you get Archie Miller in a candid moment, he says yes, but in February, we'll be happy he got those 20 minutes. You know what I mean? And I also do think Indiana misses Joey Brunk. I think it misses having sort of that secondary post anchor, you know, to give Trace Jackson Davis some time off, but also to maybe allow Indiana to not have to go so small all the time. And again, you know, like last night, there were some moments when you did feel like Indiana was just a little bit too small. And then, of course, the flip side is Indiana, it seemed like, was using those small lineups to force Florida State to go small when maybe they didn't always want to. And so that's the matchup chess game you always get into. At the same time, we've seen Archie Miller do this. We've seen other coaches do this. Coaches will always say it's the same as hearing a football coach say they want to run the ball better. Like that's just a stock and trade answer. What do you want to get better at offensively? Well, we need to be tougher in the run game. Okay. So does everybody else, because some run plays don't work. So that's just something you can say. So people will write a story that means nothing and you can throw in the trash. Basketball coaches in preseason invariably say, we think we can be deep this year. We think we can go 9, 10 players deep. We can really get into our bench. If guys step up, we can be really, really, we can have some genuine depth. And then they get to crunch time in the games that matter, and they go small C conservative, and they play what they know, and they play what they trust. And I think this season, more than most, because you didn't get all those, those throwaway guarantee games where you could run out a bunch of weird rosters or a bunch of weird rotations, and you could let your freshman run point for, 7 minutes and just see how he kind of processed some of what he was seeing in front of him and let him make some mistakes and learn from them in real time and all that. Because you didn't get that, I suspect that more coaches are just going to be even more loyal to basically what they know and what they trust. It's also worth saying Archie Miller, in his history, you look back at some of his teams at Dayton, he had some deep teams, but he also had some teams that ran very shallow. And he was happy with that. He was okay with that. Obviously, there was that one season where there were injuries and suspensions, and I think they only had 6 scholarship players by the end of the year. But even there were other years where he was pretty successful, where if you look at the minutes distribution, there's pretty much 7 or 8 guys with little bits sprinkled in here here and there. If Anthony Leal hits a couple threes, hey, he keeps playing tonight, but that doesn't mean he's going to play 25 minutes the next 5 games each. I think there's also just an element of this that is just sort of true to the way college coaches see roster management and rotation, which is you dangle that carrot in the preseason of, hey, we could play all 11 guys, we could play 10 guys, and maybe even at one level you believe it, but in the back of your mind, when you're down to with 3.5 minutes left against Florida State, you're going to the guys you trust. And you're not going to worry how many minutes they've played, and you're not going to worry about, but we need to be deeper. You're going to go back to what you know and what you feel you can rely on the most. And so I think that there's an element of that too. And of course, it's the Joey Brunk situation in particular is not ideal, and it's nobody's fault. Players get hurt. But I'm just as a practical rule, I'm always a little bit skeptical of coaches that seem to genuinely believe their bench will ever go maybe more than 9 players deep.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with most everything you said there. One of the things that's not specific to Indiana, but it involves Indiana because it's just the circumstance of the time that we're living in. And we've talked about this a lot over the offseason. We even talked about it a month ago, but now I feel like it's starting to become a little bit of a national conversation with Coach K's comments the other day. I think Fran Fraschilla had some tweets just talking about kind of the mental health aspect of these players continuing to quote unquote plow through the season here as the holidays approach. I saw last night some quotes on Twitter from someone in the Michigan media corps. I think Brendan Quinn had the tweet. I don't know if he asked the question, but Michigan's Isaiah Livers was just asked about the idea of playing a game on Christmas Day. I think Michigan's going to play at Nebraska, and he was honest in saying that he didn't necessarily wasn't thrilled. I don't want to misquote him, but the gist of it was he wasn't necessarily thrilled about the idea. And so there's a lot to unpack here, I feel like, and this is a conversation that's not going to go away. But there's been some statistics thrown out there. I think about 78 to 79% of games that have been scheduled have been played so far. So the cancellation rate, depending on how you want to look at it, is roughly a little bit over 20%. But as the circumstances in terms of the pandemic continue to worsen nationally, I don't think this is a conversation that's going away. And it's kind of made worse by the fact that the NCAA as much as people want to look at them and blame them for not having a plan this season, they only oversee the tournament. They don't oversee what the Big Ten's doing during the regular season. They don't oversee what the ACC is doing. That's why you see different testing protocols across different leagues. That's why you see different, whatever adjustments and scheduling being made. So I'm just kind of curious for your perspective on where this is headed. It doesn't feel like to me that there's any significant momentum to stop the season, to adjust anything. It does feel like a circumstance of just plowing through. And I'm just curious what you think about how it's gone so far. I know it's speaking as someone who, I can't tell you the last time I missed an Indiana home game, but I wasn't there for the Tennessee Tech game. And given the fact that I live 2 hours away and we have Tyler in Bloomington, I don't plan on going to many, if any, games at home this season as of now. It's different covering these games from afar, having these Zoom press conferences. But I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, what do you think of how it's gone so far? Do you think this is sustainable? Do you think anything's going to change? Or do you think it's just going to be, let's see what we can get done and we're going to get to the tournament no matter what happens along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing is I forgive some Sportswriter cynicism. I couldn't help but wonder if we'd have heard those same comments from Mike Krzyzewski if his team hadn't just lost back-to-back high major home games. I think that and we saw this in football too, it's not just basketball. There's been an undeniable amount of sort of pandemic blaming for a lack of success in college sports in particular. That is just sometimes feels a little disingenuous and a little bit gross is a strong word, but I think you get kind of what I'm trying to say. I will say, I think there are some legitimate concerns about mental health. I mean, like just today, Boston College, which is bowl eligible under a first-year head coach, Jeff Avley, who had a very, very good season, announced that they will not seek a bowl berth. And one of the primary reasons was athletes are basically just tired. It's been rigorous for them. They've been tested every day. They've had to isolate themselves from the community at large. I don't know how every school's handle it, but like Indiana's players didn't go home. Football players didn't go home for Thanksgiving because of concerns about them going home, gathering with families, and then bringing the virus back. Obviously, I think there's been suggestions that some other football programs that post-Thanksgiving outbreaks could be traced back to family gatherings. And everybody kind of understands, and even the players, and listen, virtually every player that I've talked to wants to play. And that's on the record. That's off the record. Like they want to play. They want to be safe and they want to be smart and they don't want to feel, sort of abused, but they want to play. But it has been, incredibly mentally and emotionally challenging. And I think you're going to see more football teams declining, particularly some of maybe the lower level bowl bids or bowl berths. So it wouldn't be surprising to see something similar, not teams declining like the NCAA tournament, obviously, but it wouldn't be surprising to see, basketball players talking about something similar that, they can't be around their families right now. I remember the first time I was away from my family for Christmas. I was covering the Pinstripe Bowl in 2015 and I got to New York on Christmas Eve morning and I thought, oh my God, like I'm just going to be alone on Christmas. Like I don't have any plans to do anything on Christmas. That's kind of depressing. I still suspect that I don't think that specifically is going to throw a wrench in things. And I do think that whether this is sustainable or not, I suspect it will be sustained. I think that's what we've learned with football. We're just like, once we've started, we're just going to keep pressing forward. But I think it would be right to be very sort of sensitive to these athletes' concerns because, I mean, listen, I don't want to speak for anybody but myself. This is hard for me. It's like there's things I miss. There's things that, and yeah, it's a lot easier for me to cover the IU Florida State game from home. And when I'm done and I file, I just go to bed rather than going back to a hotel to get up to fly to Atlanta, to fly to Indy, to drive back to Bloomington, whatever. But, our routines have been disrupted. Our sort of social networks have been shut down. And everyone is sort of saying, hey, be aware of your own mental health, your own emotional health, mental and emotional health of those around you, the people you love, whatever. Well, athletes aren't robots. And I think this is going to be, something that probably continues to come up and really probably should come up. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to complete a season. And that doesn't mean that these athletes don't want to complete a season. But it does mean that I think we just need to be aware of it and aware of the fact that this is an emotional strain on everybody involved in a way that no one could possibly have foreseen before, obviously, COVID-19.
Yeah, I think the pushback that some would give on that in terms of being, and I'm definitely 110% sensitive to what the players think, and I think that in many ways they should have a much bigger say in everything that's going on. But I think there would the one thing I think some people would push back from a Big Ten perspective is with football. When they did call off the season earlier in the year, it was basically a lot of player discontent and things like that kind of got some of the momentum to get the season back this fall. So I think some people would question, at that point they wanted the season to start back up, and now all of a sudden there's people complaining that the season's going on. So maybe a little bit of back and forth there. But the other thing that I was just kind of thinking about is, how do you think, from a practical standpoint, how would you define having a successful season just for the sport in general? Is it just making it to the tournament? Is it, it doesn't feel like I said, with the kind of the decentralized control of the sport, the NCAA before the season kind of said, we're going to go to the tournament. We're going to have the tournament. And then you had all these teams opt out. You even had some instances of coaches opting out. Is it just a matter of, it doesn't really matter at this point how many games get canceled. We're just going to try to do our best from a health perspective, and the only goal out of this is to get to the tournament? Is that how we're to look at this point? And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about in terms of the players, with the Big Ten specifically playing games around Christmas, and I don't know if you know this or not, but do you think there was any consultation between the league and coaches with players before that happened to kind of get their sign off and ask them if that's something that they would want to do?
Yeah, I think to work backward to the second one first. I mean, I would be surprised that would be out of character for leaders in college sports in general, to be frank. I don't know for sure, and it's possible they did, and the majority of players said, yeah, we just want to play. But even if that hadn't happened, to your point about, players pushing to play the football season and then maybe the football season wearing them down, well, these are still 18, 19, 20-year-old people. They don't have a lot of life experience. And
no, to be clear, I wasn't saying that was how I felt. I said that, if you came out with that take on Twitter or you wrote something about it, I think the pushback that you would get would be there would be a group of people who would say, well, these same players wanted the season to happen. They went in protested at the Big Ten, and now they're complaining that it's still going on. That's not my opinion. It's just
sorry, I didn't mean to make it sound like that, but it's there is an element of everybody just sort of having to be lenient with one another and just sort of say, like, how could any of us have known what this would be like? What would be good about it? What would be bad about it? What would be difficult? Much less, again, college freshmen, sophomores, juniors. Like, I mean, do you remember how stupid you were when you were a college student? I was really stupid. Like, I was unbelievably stupid. There's days when I'm surprised I made it out of college. And that's where I think everybody's just got to be lenient with one another. And I would also extend that sentiment to your point about a successful season. I think it is making it to the tournament. I think it is making it to the Final Four, playing a national championship game, obviously fulfilling TV contracts and making some money for everybody because everybody really needs it right now. And everyone also, just like college basketball, college basketball is the only, I know we didn't have the College World Series, and I know that makes money, but there's three really significant events on the college sports schedule above everything else with respect to baseball. The women's tournament, the men's tournament, and the bowl season. The women's and men's tournaments lost something. We're not going to lose the bowl season. We're going to lose some lower tier bowls, and there's going to be some teams that opt out, but we're still going to have a national championship, and we're still going to have a national champion in football. We didn't get that with basketball. Losing that a second straight season for all involved would be disastrous. And we could have a whole separate 4-hour-long podcast about all the implications and potential ramifications and on and on and on. But yes, I honestly just think getting to the end of the season and crowning a champion is successful. And there's going to be some teams that get screwed along the way. There's going to be some teams that get to Selection Sunday and say, well, if we hadn't been shut down for the first 6 weeks of the season, we'd have a better NCAA tournament, argument. And we're going to have to look at those teams and say, you're probably right, but this is just where we are now. And, IU football might wind up being one of those teams that just sort of has to swallow a bitter pill, whether it's deserved or not. As an example, as a localized example, and I don't know that it's the perfect one because I think IU football probably isn't getting the respect it deserves at this point from the committee in a more sort of fundamental and normal way. But it's just going to be an imperfect year. And it's going to be a year where I think, you can't be talking about like, in nearly all situations, firing coaches or making great changes or just, judging too much of what you see this season. This has just got to be a season that everybody understands. It's going to be weird. If you're and this is why I come back to Indiana being fortunate enough to get five games in already. If you're fortunate enough to get to March and you get in the tournament and you get a chance to play in it, just look at it as a huge bonus. Look at it as a success. And if you don't, I just don't think you can sweat it that much this season. Obviously, there's some cases, things like what's happened with LSU football, where it just seems like there's just been so much discontent on the roster. You still need to be concerned about situations like that and how they spin forward. But I think, for example, because I'm using football, and I know it's an imperfect comparison, but we are near the end of this football season. Penn State football is an example. It's obviously not been the season that they envisioned. They're 2-5. They're disappointed. It's been really ugly. But I think at a place like Penn State, you're always going to learn from what you did wrong and go forward. But I think there's also got to be an element of just writing a season like this off and just saying, you know what, this is not reflective of some culture problem or bad coaching or whatever. It's just a reflective of, some teams basically being claimed by an almighty weird year. And I think that we're going to get to March and have a few similar examples that we can kind of point to across college basketball as well.
Good that you brought up football because obviously I don't cover football. I don't normally talk about it on the podcast, but it's been what's the best way to put this for you, Zach? A whirlwind week for IU football and everything that's gone on. You've written a lot about it. I'm a casual. I'd say I follow the team casually. I'm not, involved in the day-to-day of IU football, but I watch some games and keep up with it. And obviously,
I've seen your Tom Allen tattoo.
Yeah,
we all know what's at stake here.
There you go. You've outed me, but just what do you make of this week? It obviously says a lot about the season that Indiana football has. That they, based on the rules that were originally developed in the fall, they were, entitled to appear in the Big Ten championship game for this season. But some things were obviously moved around based on, I think, the fact that Ohio State is, the better team right now. They beat Indiana head to head, and they're really the conference's only chance to make the college football playoff. And so the Big Ten reversed course, and I think based on a vote from athletic directors, decided that they would waive the minimum game requirement, and Ohio State is the, I believe, East champion for the Big Ten football, and will head to the championship game. Do you think Indiana was treated unfairly here? Are you there's obviously, I've talked to you a lot. There's a lot of folks on Twitter who are very upset about this, and I understand that. But at the same time, I can also understand from a financial perspective the Big Ten wanting to do what it can to get Ohio State into the college football playoff because there's an enormous amount of money at stake here. How do you kind of unwrap everything that has happened here and from IU football perspective, how they've handled this situation?
Well, I think there's two kind of concurrent discussions here. One is the Big Ten situation, which I think is the one that has probably provoked more sort of localized outrage. The other is the college football playoff situation, not in terms of Indiana's candidacy for the playoff, but in terms of where Indiana fits into the playoff rankings and what that means for Indiana's postseason. From the Big Ten perspective, and I've written this, Ohio State deserved to be in the Big Ten championship game. And I think that, religious adherence to a bunch of rules that we essentially had to write a few months ago under unprecedented circumstances, like, shouting that those rules are rules and should be followed without question just isn't, I don't know that I can really jive with that. Ohio State beat Indiana. I think there'd be a separate conversation to have if Ohio State was 5-0 and Indiana was 6-1, but they hadn't played. Or if Ohio State was 5-0 and Indiana was 6-1, but Indiana had won the game. Indiana had beaten Ohio State. But Indiana played Ohio State, and Ohio State won. And it was a great game, and Indiana played exceptionally well, and they lost. And if Ohio State had lost 200-0 to Michigan this weekend, they would still own the tiebreaker over IU because the tiebreaker isn't win percentage. It's head-to-head results. That was a change for this year and this year alone because the conference knew that it couldn't guarantee that everyone would play a full schedule. To its credit, Indiana, no one I have talked to around the football program, around the department, is not disappointed by this. There is an undeniable amount of disappointment because, of course, Indiana thought here was an opening to win a Big Ten championship game in what is one of the most memorable seasons the program's had in 50 years or more. There was also not really any sort of conspiratorial grudge, or I don't know what exactly the word, conspiratorial mood around IU football either. I think the closer you get to that program, the more the prevailing sentiment is, listen, we got our chance and we lost. And yes, okay, there were these rules that were in place, but like all season long, we've been saying that this is an unprecedented year and it's going to require unprecedented solutions. We can't suddenly say, well, rules are rules and they can't be broken when we've been breaking rules, all year long just to make this happen. I get why people are frustrated, and I think it's perfectly within the rights of fans who, have probably seen the Big Ten, sort of walk on Indiana for someone else's benefit in the past. I get that. From within this conversation, Indiana, Ohio State, and the Big Ten, I think Indiana fought the decision, but I think Indiana also accepts the decision. The concurrent discussion is the playoff rankings and the committee's entrenchment of IU at 12, which is at this point likely the cutoff line for the New Year's Six. And the suggestion 1 week after Indiana beats a team that the committee ranked higher than the AP or the coaches on the road, that team actually isn't any good, despite the committee thinking that team, despite in 1 week, the committee suggesting that team is good enough to maybe, if it wins that game, leapfrog into the New Year's Six places. Suddenly the committee saying, no, that team's not any good. And Indiana gets no credit for that. No credit for that win. And we're certainly not moving Indiana ahead of Georgia, even though Georgia has no top 25 wins. And their most impressive win of the season is a week 2 home blowout of an Auburn team that's 5-4 and has won 2 games this season that the SEC more or less felt compelled to apologize for because of bad refereeing decisions near the end of them. How do you justify 2 2-loss Big 12 programs ahead of Indiana? How do you, I get that Michigan, Penn State, it's a down year for those programs, but I also have a fair bit of sympathy for the idea that if, for example, Wisconsin had Indiana's resume, Wisconsin would be in the top 10. And I think that's more the frustration, because it is very difficult to square the consistency of the deliberative process as it's being presented by the committee, with having Indiana 12, both Oklahoma and Iowa State ahead of Indiana. Georgia has not left the top 10. You don't want to get into the politics of it, because then you're just purely speculating, but you do look at the makeup of the committee. And, here's Scott Strickland, who's the AD at Florida, whose team is trying to push its way into the top 4. What's Florida's best win? Georgia. Here's Joe Castiglione, who, unless I'm mistaken, is still the AD at Oklahoma. He obviously wants Oklahoma and to be very fair, probably also just the Big 12 in general, to be well represented. So how do you justify putting two loss teams, both of whom have significantly better wins, but also significantly worse losses than Indiana, ahead of Indiana? Well, and we can do this in a lot of different directions. And of course, the Big Ten has people in the room too. The committee is chaired by Gary Barta, who's the athletic director at Iowa. And it's also possible, as we sit here and debate this and claim these things are controversial or hard to understand, that the committee may be looking, for example, at the Big 12 and saying, well, one of these two teams is going to lose the Big 12 championship game. And so it really doesn't matter where they're ranked right now. We'll drop them below Indiana as long as Indiana still has one loss on Selection Sunday. And Indiana will be fine. They'll get into the top 11. They'll be fine. It could be that the committee is sort of just trying to set up dominoes to fall later. But as it stands right now, I think where Indiana is justified in feeling frustrated is every time anybody is asked questions of this team, they've just kind of gone out and proven themselves again and again and again. And it seems like every time they get disregarded for that, certainly in the eyes of the people who ultimately will decide their fate in terms of where they go bowling and just how special of a season this gets to be once it gets to the postseason. And when you're when it all kind of comes at once, Tuesday night, the rankings drop and you find out you're not being given any credit whatsoever for a win at Wisconsin. And then Wednesday, the Big Ten takes the conference championship game away from you. It just sort of feels like what I've written and stand by is that Ohio State deserves its shot in the Big Ten championship game. Indiana doesn't deserve to be treated this way. Indiana's earned better simply by its performances this season. It's a good team, and it deserves more respect and more credit than it's being given, again, by the people who ultimately have authority over kind of how Indiana's season ends.
So what's the next couple of weeks look like? Obviously, Indiana's shut down right now based on the rising cases of COVID-19. And there's obviously a potential, is it crossover game to be played here down the road the same weekend as the Big Ten championship game? Is that right, Zach?
Yeah, so that is the plan. Obviously, we will see what happens, particularly at Indiana. Indiana's still shut down. Scott Dolson and Tom Allen are both expected to speak on Tom Allen's radio show tonight as we talk on Thursday. So we'll know more about, hopefully more about just kind of where Indiana stands. Of course, when this has happened around the conference, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Maryland, recently Michigan, before the season started, Rutgers was in this position. It has typically taken about 2 weeks to kind of shut down, get all the positives under control, quarantine everyone, and then get to a point where you feel like you are safe to restart activity. Of course, the one exception is Ohio State, which only missed one game, the Illinois game. Now, Ohio State did put a significantly depleted roster on the field at Michigan State last weekend. But, of course, that was still more than enough with Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson, whoever was playing, for Ohio State to win that game comfortably. Now, does Indiana feel first of all, can Indiana do that? Second of all, would Indiana feel so compelled? Would they feel the stress to be able to say, well, we're going to roll out there with who we've got because we're just going to make that happen? I don't know. So I think it's very much going to be watch this space for the next few days, even over the weekend into early next week before we have a better sense. If Indiana played that game, it would be Iowa. My understanding is it's likely it would be in Bloomington. I don't know that that's been announced yet. We're less than a week or less than 2 weeks away from these games in the Big Ten, as has kind of been their MO all season, have not given anyone any firm details, at least not publicly, about how this is all going to work, which says a lot in itself. But my understanding is that it seems likely Bloomington will be the host for that game. And I think that may be determined by the fact that Indiana was scheduled to have 5 Big Ten home games this year. I think it's an East-West thing, but anyway, I know Indiana was scheduled to have 5 home games this year. Iowa was only scheduled to have 4. So my understanding is that's possibly part of the reason why it would be held at Memorial Stadium. If Indiana were to win that game, Iowa right now is 16th in the playoff rankings. You would think, Indiana did just beat the number 16 team in the playoff rankings and got no credit for it. But you would think that would do Indiana a favor with the selection committee. If you're Indiana, you could also look at it and say, well, if it's not safe for us to be sending guys out there, or maybe even if we have a roster but it's heavily depleted, do we risk going out there and losing that game? And then, that's it. That's our New Year's Six candidacy kind of up in smoke. So, there's a lot of layers to that, but ultimately it's just going to come down first to how quickly Indiana can kind of contain what's obviously kind of broken out here.
Yeah, that was going to be my last question. Was you kind of answered it there? Was does Indiana need to play that game in order to make a New Year's Six bowl? And I think we'll see it, but I do think that's definitely something that's got to be top of mind for them, because missing out on the Big Ten championship is obviously a disappointment, but the fact that they're kind of in the neighborhood for being in one of those bowl games, and they definitely want to make it into one of those. I assume that if they didn't make it into New Year's Six, they're still going to play a bowl game of some kind. But obviously,
right? Yeah, you'll still
is not the same.
No, yeah, it's
that lane.
You would probably see them in a Citrus Bowl.
Okay.
And that would be, you would be talking about them in at absolute worst, an Outback Bowl. And this is also where I think a lot of people wonder, and this is the sort of thing that I imagine is going to play itself out largely behind closed doors. But a lot of people wonder if, any horse trading can be done with regard to Indiana, maybe saying, hey, we're not going to raise, we put out a pretty conciliatory statement about, the Big Ten championship game decision, and other than sort of, through a spokesperson saying we're going to back our players, and, we voted against it because we're always going to back the guys we got. We're not raising a big stink about this, certainly not publicly, not nearly as publicly as some of the Big Ten's ADs and coaches did about, shoving Indiana out of the game. But what we're going to expect in return is, somebody to do us a favor when it comes time to, pick bowls, and maybe we find a way into the top 10. Maybe if for whatever reason we're not there, we're guaranteed first pick of the rest, which would be the Citrus Bowl, and has a pretty significant financial payout. Now, a lot of that goes back to the conference, but it's the prestige and the opportunity. So I think there's a lot that remains to be seen on that front. And it's just, it's really not dissimilar to the NCAA tournament situation. Like, as much as we want to speculate every Monday when all the new brackets come out for the 4 weeks leading into Selection Sunday, we just have to wait and see what the field looks like when we get there.
Zach, thanks as always for taking the time. You can always read Zach's work at indystar.com. Subscribe. Click through his links on Twitter. I think he's on Twitter at Zach Osterman, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.